Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tips for a Successful NDA Submission, presented by Roe. I'm Rebecca Williamson, the publisher of the Life Sciences Group, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are David Shoemaker, Senior Vice President of R&D at Roe, Rob Wilson, Chief Strategist of Biostatistics and Data Standards for the Regulatory Submissions at Roe, and Bob Rohde, Submission Services Consultant at Rohde Submission Services. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. I have just a few technical notes for you before we begin. If you have any trouble reading a slide, please hold and drag the right corner of the slide window to enlarge. And please also disable your pop-up blocker to participate in the interactive parts of the presentation. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Download Slides widget at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. And finally, we'll be following the presentations with a Q&A session. So please submit your questions during or after the presentations using that Q&A box at the right side of your screen. All right, that's everything from me. David, please go ahead.
Thanks, Rebecca. So thanks for joining us today. What we'd like to do is lay out some tips that will help you as well as us if you ever work with us in submitting an NDA or a BLA. We have two excellent and experienced regulatory workers in Bob Rohde in submissions and Rob Wilson in data standards. And they are two of the most creative people I have ever met and worked with in solving your problems if you get into a bind with submissions or with data standards. But they're going to try to educate you on what you could do to make their lives easier. So with that, I'm going to let Bob take it away.
Okay, I'm going to give this discussion from the perspective of viewing the IND as a tool to leverage into your NDA. They are two separate regulatory activities, but in reality, leveraging your IND into your NDA is something that I think a lot of companies don't really give full consideration. And so that's going to be kind of my perspective on this. And I'm really coming at this from an angle of starting very early. And that really is one of the key messages for a smooth NDA is to start early, to start thinking about it during your IND. Get processes in place. If you're using vendors, don't wait to the last minute. Take the time to choose your vendors wisely. Figure out, what it is that's missing in your IND. Obviously, there are a lot of things that are not in the IND that you're going to need for the NDA. Start thinking about your regulatory strategy and how it can dovetail with your submission strategy. Because if you can start early and take the approach of incrementally reviewing, incrementally writing, publishing, taking on things that you know that you can do now, that you can do early, you're really going to be better off. And you're going to discover problems early, and that's one of the key messages, I think, is looking for those problems and solving them early rather than at the last minute during that flurry of activity you have before the NDA. Now you have to think about what your IND is. Is it paper? That's a funny question, I think, for some people these days, but you would be surprised. I just ran into one the other day that was the old-fashioned 10-item IND, and it was in paper, and they're getting ready to go to an NDA, and obviously an electronic NDA. So that really presents a lot of issues. So take a look at your IND. What is it? Are you really ready to go to the ECTD? Because there's a lot of things you need to think about. Medical writers being, I think, one of the key things. You've got a lot of tools like templates, toolbars, style guides that you need to think about and get lined up, get accustomed, get trained on if you haven't done this before. And then there's the publishing topic. And there's a decision that I think a lot of companies need to think about, and that's in-house document publishing. That can make the process go a lot quicker, the submission publishing, if you can do it or if you can line up somebody to do it. And that's getting your Module 4, Module 3 studies submission ready. Because a lot of those documents, chances are complete way before that last minute or that last push before the NDA. And so thinking about getting those submission ready, either in-house or using a vendor, is also going to smooth the process out. Well, if you've got an IND in eCTD format, you're well on your way. One of the questions I always have to ask when people say, "Oh, our IND is in eCTD format," and I say, "Oh, really? Great, that's great. Well, when did you do the initial IND?" And then there's a stop and there's a pause, and they say, "Well, the initial IND was done in paper." Well, that kind of negates, or I wouldn't say negate, but that kind of changes the perspective there. So that's something to think about, is was your initial IND, even though you may be electronic now, was your initial IND electronic? And how good have you been in keeping it up to date? I'm always amazed at INDs that are not kept up to date, and FDA hasn't held their feet to the fire. It's more common than you think. Was your IND published in-house or through a contractor? If it's published through a contractor, do you have all of the source documents? Do you have all the IND maintenance submissions? Do you have all those pieces? Because if you're going to use a different vendor for your contract publishing, you want to think about getting a hold of all of those documents, because you may need to leverage those as you create your NDA. And has that IND been transferred between sponsors? And this happens a lot these days when INDs get transferred between sponsors. The original sponsor may be in possession of a lot of documents, a lot of source files that you're going to need. And you need to think about getting them sooner rather than later. Again, it's that don't wait till the last minute concept. Okay, now I'm going to go through each module and just in a very high level go over some of the issues you need to think about as you look at leveraging that IND into your NDA. And in Module 1, it's primarily new content. If your IND has any age on it, it was probably done using the original FDA Module 1 outline, the original FDA Module 1 schema. Think about using the latest and greatest, the new Module 1. You're going to be better off. You really need to do it in the new Module 1. I see a lot of companies continue to use the old one. But most of the content in Module 1 is going to be new. There's a few things. Your IND correspondence, you're going to need to put that into the new Module 1. If you have a 505(b)(2) NDA, letters of authorization from your drug substance suppliers, you're going to want to grab those. But really, it's labeling, from my perspective, in the NDA, the key part in Module 1 is labeling. You want to think about getting an SPL supplier, vendor, to get that label into SPL format. But you really want to start thinking about that annotated label. That's one of the key parts of the NDA. It's often left to the last minute and almost as an afterthought. But having a draft label, a package insert, and and knowing where all those statements that your marketing folks or you want to make on that label, knowing where all the data that supports all those statements, because you're going to need to annotate that label and support all those statements. And that is a key part of the NDA, and it's one that I often see folks leave to the end. So start thinking about that annotated label, and if you can, draft a package insert sooner rather than later. And this is really not a publishing issue, but it often becomes one, because that can often be that last-minute thing that delays your NDA, because all of a sudden, at the last minute, we realize, oh my God, we've got to have an annotated label, and what we have doesn't really reflect what we want. Okay, Module 2 summaries. This is the heart of your NDA. You've got summaries in your IND, non-clinical and CMC summaries. Most likely they reflect the initial IND. Most likely there are changes that have to be made for the NDA. So how much can you repurpose? Is it worth repurposing the non-clinical and CMC summaries, or do you just want to start from scratch? Some companies will do that. They'll just start from scratch. My guess is that your tabular summaries, you certainly can reuse those. Your written summaries, depending on your initial IND, you may want to put a different spin on those. Do you have new non-clinical studies? Most likely you have at least a few, so your summaries are going to need to reflect those. Your quality overall summary, most likely you've got, a variety of different things that you've updated on drug product that you're going to need to reflect in those summaries. So start thinking about how much rewriting and republishing you're going to need to do for those summaries. Start thinking about that early, because those are the sections of your NDA that you should be able to incrementally write, review, and publish long before your final clinical studies are coming in. And this is that incremental review, writing and publishing that I'm talking about, that getting those non-clinical and CMC documents done as soon as you can really comes out ahead. And then you've got your clinical summaries, which are going to be all new. And it's really quite a bit of resources. Again, CMC, you're going to have formulation updates, process scale-up, new storage stability studies, batch records. All of these have supporting documents that may not be in the IND. Find those documents. Don't wait till the last minute. Find those documents, make sure they're electronic, and again, get them submission ready. There's a lot of things you can do in advance with those documents, because most likely you have many of them. Again, Module 4, this is the least amount of publishing rework, the least amount of rework in general. If you had a paper IND, obviously get your electronic copies of those. And really, are all your non-clinical studies submitted to the IND? This is also an opportunity for you to standardize those studies. Many times they're done by different vendors. They may have different publishing standards. They all may look entirely different. FDA really likes to see a consistent view, a consistent pattern, consistent bookmarking standards, hyperlinking. That's things you can do now. It's easy to fix. It's electronic navigation. That's something you can do now. And Module 5, now here's where we really run into a lot of the holes. Because of the completed studies, are they in the IND? Did you really submit them? I'm amazed at how many companies submit, if anything, interim reports rather than the final studies. And at the last minute before the NDA, they go, oh my gosh, we only have an interim report. we don't have the final report in submission-ready format. Review it very carefully. Do you have all the appendices, the tables, listings, and figures? Are they all out there? Were they done 5 years ago? Is that CRO that did them now out of business? I've encountered this on more than one occasion. Start looking for that stuff now. And this really applies to the data sets. You know, the days of FDA wanting data sets supporting your pivotal studies, your phase 3 studies, those days are pretty much over. FDA is looking for data sets on all the studies. So do you have all of those data sets? Do you have all the annotated case report forms, all the supporting documents? Do you have all the CRFs? Are they all submission ready? That's something you need to look for sooner rather than later. So in a nutshell, those are the issues I think you need to think about as you move that IND into an NDA.
Thanks, Bob. I'm going to talk about my recommendations for a successful marketing application. And my recommendations, or singular recommendation, will sound awfully similar to Bob's, but I'll do so under the umbrella of data standards and submissions. Let me first tell you what I'm not going to talk about. I will not get into the weeds on various acronyms and the highly technical aspects of data submissions. That's left for another talk and left for a discussion with an expert one-on-one. Instead, what I'm going to talk about is a high-level, one singular recommendation and then some foundation for why we ought to do this. So let me offer a little bit of background first. I don't want to. I'll give you my elevator speech on the next slide. I think all of us who've been involved in clinical trials, and in particular those of us who've been involved in marketing applications, can agree that the format, content, completeness, the overall reviewability of clinical data, and for that matter, non-clinical data, play a central and important role in the approval of a new chemical entity. In the past, as Bob has mentioned, this was the format and content of data were quite frankly an afterthought, something that was thought about in the weeks in a worst case scenario or months right before an application was to be submitted and hopefully filed. One of my favorite phrases is that the statistician will take care of it. They'll go ahead and get all this together for us, and it'll all be fine. They'll push the integration button. Now, times have changed a bit, and I will touch on that in just a moment. But, several of us in the industry have been an advocate for early planning when it comes to data format and content, and the FDA has now laid out a rather clear set of recommendations and standards on this topic. And this has created an impetus for us to do this planning very, very early in a clinical development program. I'm going to go ahead and talk about first, my recommendation, which is just like Bob's right at the beginning of the slide, and the single best piece of advice I can give to a sponsor as they are moving along through their clinical development program and eyeing the potential marketing application. I would put this in the context of the current FDA landscape, and then I'll also put this in the context of the integrating statistician, for lack of a better phrase, his or her shoes, and what it takes to bring all this data together and whether or not it can be successfully done without that planning. So my single piece of advice to keep this high level is to start with the end in mind. Very similar to Bob, as much as you can, plan early. Now, it's easy to pay lip service to this. I think we all want to plan early wherever we can, but we always don't have the time, the resources, the funding to do that. Well, we have a new impetus, as I discussed. Let me start with a couple of the questions on this slide. So there are countless questions that must be asked at the beginning of or prior to starting a clinical development program, and the first two are examples of some very broad questions that need to be asked and answered with some level of detail before embarking. Those last two, though, are questions that were often put off to the end. Gee, what format does the data need to be submitted in for review? I think that was, again, left to someone in a cubicle over in a corner. They'll tackle that, and they'll do that at the 11th hour for us and make sure it all goes in and they push the button. Well, similarly, how will the data be presented and integrated to support meaningful scientific review at whatever regulatory body we're dealing with? I'll be talking about the FDA here for just the next few minutes. But I think we can all admit those are items that are pushed off to the back. Well, things are changing. Let me give you so that's my that's my piece of advice. Let me give you the why and why it's worth to invest in this early, and why I think this will pay off in the end. The current FDA landscape certainly has changed a bit, actually rather dramatically over the course of the last several years. I think as many of you know, or at least have heard, standards are something that have gone from a development stage. I think everybody's heard the acronym SDTM, for example, to a rather robust set of very clear rules and standards that have now been adopted and in some cases actually mandated by the FDA. This signals an evolution from developing standards really to the utility of standardized data and how the FDA is going to use this data. With that comes heightened data standards. And the FDA has talked quite a bit about their Jumpstart program, for example, and the expectations that go along with what will this data look like when we get it, how can we use the tools that we've now built to front-load review wherever we can, et cetera. So when we're confronted with this, geez, what do we do? Whether it's late in the game or it's early in the game, what are the pathways? Well, there are countless pathways, but the three general big buckets that I'll touch on briefly here are as follows. One, there's the sort of preferred path that those of us sitting in my shoes who have done this a number of times now really advocate for, and I think has proven worthwhile when it comes to meaningful scientific and ultimately successful review, and that is that we follow the set of standards that have been laid out by CDISC and a couple of other side groups, but that have been largely adopted by the FDA, which I'll talk about in just a moment, where that planning has taken place up front, leads to timely submission, ultimately successful filing, et cetera. The second path is, we have data that are in all sorts of formats and no real standards here, but we still need to get to the FDA, so we will embark on a plan to clean up this data a bit, get it to the FDA with nice documentation, et cetera. And then the third path, which I rarely recommend, but unfortunately we'll be faced with doing this some more as we don't plan potentially the way we should, but still need to meet FDA requirements, legacy conversions from some old data to some CDISC compliant standard. So geez, which to choose? Well, the FDA has told us which one we need to choose, quite frankly, and although there are a lot of words on this document, or on this slide, I'm just going to highlight a couple things. A few years ago, FDASIA was signed into law. Most importantly, that reauthorized PDUFA, and specifically PDUFA 5, and one of the elements of that was to call for the standardization of study data. And in 2014, February, followed by December, some final guidance documents were released, and some language in there was awfully key. And one of those, some of that language was the requirement, mandate / binding language that certain data standards need to be used. When we don't follow these standards, the FDA has said they can and will issue a refuse to file. So what I'm showing here is a portion of one of the three key documents that was released. Another key document I want to touch on here that certainly encourages us to make these decisions sooner is the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide, which is a document the FDA puts out. It's a living document and incorporated by reference into those other two guidance documents. And it lays out the exact standards that ought to be followed. There's much more detail in the FDA data in the FDA's Data Standards Catalog page, but you get some sense of exactly what it is that they're expecting. For those of you who potentially haven't submitted data in these formats, documentation in these formats, annotated CRS in these formats, et cetera, it's a rather daunting task to try to pick this up late in the game and conform to FDA expectations. I will note these FDA expectations will take effect for studies starting on or after December 2016. So keep that in mind if we have impending applications out there. But certainly, getting back to my theme, this is the why one might want to start early in the planning now. This investment, if you have a successful compound, is either going to take place very late in the game, which can be expensive, time-consuming, inaccurate, or it can take place early on, can be well-organized, thoughtful, and focus on the science at the later stages of the game can take place. Let me move briefly to the second part of my discussion on why we have to plan early, and that is, what are the expectations for what the data ought to look like when it makes it to a regulatory body, and in this case, let's just focus on the FDA. In short, integrated databases ought to make FDA reviewers confident in those databases. They are accurate, they are complete, they allow for complete assessment of the risk-benefit profile of the compound. They are high-quality databases, easily understood and well-documented. They conform to certain standards and requirements, and within there are easy to replicate results, which, as we all know, they do. So if we don't plan early, can we achieve this? Well, we can. Briefly here, let me quickly touch on the terminology I'm talking about here. So as Bob talked about in Module 5, I'm talking about the data that ultimately appear in 5351 and 5353, those two modules, the individual study data and as well the integrated data. So can we achieve this if we don't plan in advance, don't think about what needs to be integrated, why it needs to be integrated, etc.? Well, I think we've all seen programs that look like this. Let me quickly explain what the slide looks like. I've seen this all too often in my experience. So each one of these rows on the slide represents what the sort of the data flow of a study from data collection through CSR presentation may look like. And within one's program, we may see something that looks like the top row, which is awfully nice. We go from CRF data to SDTM, and we follow basic CDIS standards all the way through the CSR. That's really nice. And typically, you'll see nowadays phase 3 studies that look like that and follow that flow. In the next row, you'll see a few studies within a program that looks something like, well, yeah, geez, we collected the data. It's in legacy format. We tried to make some analysis data sets. CRO's out of business now. We can't find them anymore, but we still have the data, and we use that to create the CSR. And then the rest are, well, these were our phase 1 studies, and we did the best we could. We were on a tight budget, and we went directly from those data to the TLFs and the CSR. So can we integrate this data in such a way that, yes, this is presentable to the FDA. We can make FDA reviewers confident in our database. We can offer a complete and accurate safety profile, sure. But in the end, I think as everyone can imagine, this can get expensive, time-consuming, certainly error-prone. As a statistician, you're spending an awful lot of time harmonizing rather than in the science and the actual statistics involved. There are often a number of the can-we type questions that come up. Can we analyze this? Can we analyze that? They're great to answer if the data are already in place. They're harder to answer when when we're struggling to pull work like this together. Now, I will note, as I've pointed out, is this a viable approach going forward, this type of planning? No, we can still get away with it for a little while, but not much longer. The data flow process that one needs to plan for, and again, in a data standardization plan, not talking about the how here, but the why, a data standardization plan should lay out something that looks a little more like this. Data collected in a CDISC compliant format, moving right through the CDISC standard models, et cetera. And then being able to integrate those data directly into the integrated database. Now, the key here is when I say start early, like Bob, starting at the IND stage here is key. This is something the FDA is slowly pushing us all towards, moving earlier and earlier up to IND stage. Starting at proof of concept these days is fine and better than where we've been before, so you get proof of concept type work. But IND is ultimately where one wants to be and where we actually see the most benefits in terms of time, quality reviews, and successful outcomes, et cetera.
Thanks, Rob. I will, as soon as I can get this mouse to behave, move on. And I'm going to sort of touch on a lot of the themes that Bob and Rob have been talking about, and then expand on some other common efficiencies that could be done at your company. And so I'm going to start by asking, at your company, have you convinced yourself that you have a product? And this is sort of the starting point. When everyone in the company agrees, you've got a product, and where do you go from here? And that is, it can be done at various stages, but I advise you not to listen to your peers in your company, but to vet that opinion with outside individuals. And these are just some of the outside individuals. I mean, a big pharma company has a department for each one of these groups. But if you're not a big pharma, you need to work a little bit to get input from these opinion leaders, and you may not have to go to a venture capital firm to get an opinion, but you should touch base with several independent product development consultants, and I think most importantly, independent consultants who have taken several products to market. They know what the path is. They know what pitfalls are going to be seen. And then obviously third-party payers and key opinion leaders for implementation in the medical realm. So when your company decides that you've got a product, where are you in development? And that is a matter of magic in my experience. Some companies come to us at the pre-IND stage convinced that they have a product. They have no toxicities, and they're just rolling over one another. And it's kind of schizophrenic because as convinced as they are that they have a product, they're making no preparation for their marketing application. They're not thinking about the marketing application at all. It's just hop, skip, and jumping from CRO to CRO to do different studies, making no attempt to integrate the data. So you end up with 8 different CROs that you have to go back to, as we said before, some who have gone out of business, and you're trying to pull that together for the FDA. If you finish phase 1, chances are you're safe. You don't have no efficacy data, but you might have a product. But I think I want to focus in on the proof of concept. If you have demonstrated to your opinion and to the opinions of independent consultants that you actually have a product, there's probably a pretty good chance that you're going to marketing applications. So why wait? I know it costs money to do some of these activities, but it's getting less and less costly at the early stages, and it's getting more and more expensive to make up this work at the end stage. So certainly by proof of concept, you should start gearing up for your marketing application. Now, what does that mean, gearing up? I think, first of all, you need to appoint a team. And these are just some of the team members that you have to have, and you have to be comprehensive. And I'm going to talk about a couple of tools that I recommend using that all of these people should be familiar with. And I think another important topic is that each of these individuals should have an understanding of the regulatory requirements from their particular discipline. Do not rely on some regulatory person to tell everybody what it is they're required to do. Every single one of these professionals has a responsibility to understand the latest guidances and what's expected from a regulatory perspective if you're going to have a smooth application process. And leading this team, you have a project leader who has taken several products to market, has seen pitfalls that will be fallen into if people don't hold up their end of the bargain. And these people should have an understanding of each of those disciplines on the previous slide, and they should understand the regulatory requirements as well, and they will if they've taken several products to market. I have seen disaster after disaster with the appointing of an individual who's never led a marketing application before attempt to lead a team and obviously be educated in the process. And it just leads to a very expensive random walk. Now, a couple of tools I want to talk about. Bob and Rob touched on some of these. I think the target product profile. This is something that's been advocated by FDA for 20 years. You've probably heard the term, and I would say that less than 10% of the companies that we work with use it. It is such a valuable tool. You can use it at the pre-IND meeting stage. We're actually preparing a target product profile for a 505(b)(2) NDA at this point in time, and we're actually setting up the referenced product in a column next to our product with the annotation. So we're actually starting to annotate the findings in the package insert right from the beginning. And this is the target product profile should transition to your annotated label at some point. But you can start it off in the right format, and it just makes everything a lot easier. And then the second tool I want to talk about is the living clinical database that was advocated recently by FDA in a guidance in December of last year, where they're encouraging companies to maintain a real-time assessment of the safety of their product and understand trends in real time, not just at the NDA or BLA stage. So once you've reached proof of concept, I think the next activity is preparation for the end of phase 2 meeting. And this is the beginning of the end game, as I have written here. It is so important that this meeting go well, and it will not go well unless you prepare thoroughly and you ask the right questions. And if you include the target product profile or an annotated package insert, that gives FDA an idea of where you're headed, and it gives you an idea, as Bob said, of where the holes are that you have yet to fill in your development program. So this is a tool. It's a living document. It transitions into the annotated package insert, which is the ultimate product in your marketing application, and it can be reviewed periodically with the team, just as your development safety update report is reviewed on an annual basis, and it keeps everybody abreast with where the train is going. And it answers a lot of questions that otherwise come up. So obviously there are 3 primary areas: clinical, non-clinical, CMC quality, that are focused on at the end of phase 2 meeting. These questions that you derive for this meeting should, in all likelihood, help drive the marketing application approach. And regulatory, obviously, it's focused around the draft package insert. So in my opinion, the ideal outcome from an EOP2 meeting, and this has happened, half a dozen times in my experience, is that FDA agrees that the safety is acceptable for the anticipated efficacy that you're going to generate in your phase 3 trials. They are happy with the safety. They have no signals and if there are signals, that you monitor them. But you focus on efficacy from this point forward, and you continue to monitor safety, but the end game is primarily about efficacy, and you just keep your fingers crossed that no safety signals emerge. And then the questions that you can have is you can submit. I recommend submitting your complete phase 3 protocols at the end of phase 2 meeting, where FDA will review and comment on. And if you get agreement on those phase 3 study designs, you're off and running to your NDA or BLA, and you're just, it's a question of execution. Non-clinical should be focused on, are we done? This is all we've done. You summarize what you've done in the package, and if you have any additional studies like carcinogenicity studies ongoing, you tell them about that. But basically, this is the totality of what we intend to submit in the NDA. Are we good? And it's simple as that. One question. Similarly with CMC, you can have some things going on. You can not have completed your commercial batch preparations. There may be stability studies that are ongoing. But calling that away and asking FDA, if this work comes to fruition as we intended, are we done? Are we done with all CMC quality activities? And in that case, both Module 4 and Module 3 can be sent to the publisher and begin to assemble your marketing application. Now, as far as regulatory, in addition to the package insert that you include, there are some belated questions, and I say belated because at this point in time, you should already know if you're going to be awarded breakthrough therapy designation. You should already know if you're going to go the accelerated approval route, because that would be at the end of phase 1 meeting, not the end of phase 2 meeting. But you can still ask if you're priority review eligible, and just plant the seed in FDA's mind that you're going to be asking for priority review when you submit your NDA or BLA. The breakthrough therapy designation is a relatively new path that has been abused by a lot of sponsors because they've supplied FDA with sub-quality data sets in order for FDA to interpret whether or not what they say they have is in fact what they have. So I strongly encourage you to contact FDA ahead of time before you submit a breakthrough therapy designation full proposal, or full application because the attrition rate is very high. And then you can also focus on, as Bob said, completing Module 1 and assembling the documents that are going to be needed and publish those. So finally, I want to talk about the case for a clinical database, a living clinical database. There was a guidance that came out from FDA at the end of last year talking about a safety assessment committees for your product. And what that is a committee. It's not a DSMB or a data monitoring board that reviews one study. It is a committee that your company has anointed to review the safety data of your product on an ongoing basis. In order to do that, you need a database that you have confidence in that is giving you correct data and not a hodgepodge of Excel spreadsheets from 5 different CROs. So I strongly encourage you to get that guidance, take a look at it, and then identify the safety assessment committee individuals at your company who can perform that function. This clinical database allows you to do a lot of things. It facilitates preparation of development safety update reports, which is, in my experience, a nightmare for many companies. It facilitates preparation of the end of phase 2 meeting package, and ultimately it folds right into your marketing application. So it does cost a little bit, and I can see people waiting, but I certainly wouldn't wait any longer than the proof of concept stage to assemble that database. So in summary, I think we've probably hit home that you should start your marketing application as soon as possible, leveraging those aspects of the eCTD and the data guidance that FDA has issued. But in as much as it costs a little money, I would just advise start that no later than proof of concept. Vet your conclusion that you have an approvable product. At least I personally have worked with many companies who have gone all the way through phase 3 for no need, when it was apparent to some experts at phase 2 that there was no product there. Use regulatory standard data formats as Rob was suggesting, and generating high quality databases. Publish as soon as possible, as Bob was suggesting, in a rolling fashion. Put as much to bed as you can early. And finally, use FDA recommended tools to ensure a successful marketing application. And I will throw it back to Rebecca for the Q&A period. Thank you all very much.
Okay, great. Really nice presentations, everyone. All right, we'll move on to Q&A now, and we'll see if we've got time for a couple questions here. So first question for you. Does non-clinical data from in-house studies need to be in a standardized format?
So this is Rob who gave the data discussion. Very shortly, the answer is yes. CDISC has a standard that some have probably heard of, SEND. I think it's Standard Exchange for Non-Clinical Data format, and this is the format that should be used and can be found on the FDA's data standards catalog, which is available on their website. There's a little bit of time here before the guidance takes full effect, where it doesn't have to be done, and quite frankly, almost all sponsors are still not doing this, but very shortly, yes, that should be planned for.
Okay, great. Next question for you. For Module 5, do all programs need to be executable and included in the submission?
This is Rob again. No, they do not need to be executable. My general recommendation, having done a number of these and interacting with reviewers, is that phase 3 programs for tables, most importantly, and all of the analysis data sets should be included, should be in an ASCII format following the naming conventions found in the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide. Relevant macros used to create those tables and data sets should be included as well, along with documentation helping the reviewer find all of this information. But the programs themselves do not need to be executable, a common misconception.
great. Another question for you here. Should we talk about the Safety Assessment Committee during the EOP2 meeting?
Yeah, so this is David. Not unless you want to let FDA know that you're not doing it from the beginning. Ultimately, FDA's guidance was that this should be done as soon as you start to collect safety data on your product. That they recognize not everyone, it's only a guidance, they recognize not everybody's going to be doing it, but I would not rub sand in the wounds by telling FDA that you have not started your safety assessment committee until that stage. They want you to have a very good handle on your safety from the first time it goes into a human.
Okay, good. Next question for you here. What is the most effective organizational piece of software you've used in preparing an NDA?
Well, there's a number of tools out there. I'm not, we work with a lot of different companies, so we've seen probably everything. I think it's more the individual who's pulling the data together than it is the software, quite frankly. I think a lot of pieces of software can do it. An Excel spreadsheet can do it if it's organized well. And so it's really a tool that is comprehensive, that pulls in data from all disciplines and tracks. One of the most important things is to track decisions that are made in the preparation of the marketing application so that you don't go back and revisit those, or if you do go back and revisit those, there's somewhat of a higher energy of activation in order to overturn, and you don't spend as much time on it. And I'll let Bob answer from his perspective.
Yeah, from a practical standpoint for the NDA, having a list of every single file that is going into the NDA and who's responsible for it, where's it coming from, is it submission ready, where does it belong in the outline, that is a very important tool that will not only help the publisher, but help the submission team. And those documents generally need to be kept up to date, rather than it just, okay, we've put this information together one time, it changes constantly, and the individuals responsible for the disciplines should be the folks who keep up their disciplines. Your CMC person should be keeping up that list of every single file, every analytical method, every validation report, every little piece that goes into the NDA.
Okay, great. When can you start the rolling submission once you're sure you have an approvable product?
Okay, well, we've been using the term pretty loosely here because FDA has a rolling submission that they allow, and Bob has been referring to, publishing certain modules of the marketing application in a rolling fashion. They're two distinct things, so I want to first talk about FDA's, and then I'll let Bob talk about when you can start rolling publishing. FDA permits, and they have permitted, rolling submissions of marketing applications for some time. You have to get agreement from FDA. In my experience, it isn't really worth the time invested. If it's ready, go ahead and submit it. If you finish Module 4, you can go ahead and submit it. What a rolling submission does not mean is a rolling review by FDA. All it is doing is getting it off your plate and on FDA's, and they're housing it for you. So it's nice if they let you do it to get it in and get it off your plate, but in very rare cases, except with breakthrough therapy designations at this point in time, does a rolling submission mean an actual expedited review by FDA.
Yeah, I can concur with David. I've been involved with some rolling submissions that the sponsors submitted in a rolling fashion over a period of time, and FDA never looked at them until the phase 3 studies came in. It was to the great chagrin of some of these sponsors that thought that their products were being reviewed as soon as they submitted them, and it really wasn't the case. It can occur, And make no mistake, it can occur, but most of the time it really doesn't. But what I'm talking about in the publishing world is really incremental publishing, and it can start pretty early. It is a little bit more expensive because if you're using a vendor, it's going to be a bit more expensive than waiting to the last minute, but you're going to reach your timeline, your submission goal, much sooner. And you can start, certainly near after proof of concept, when you're certain you have a product, building Module 4 and Module 3, taking a look at your non-clinical and CMC summaries to see how much you can do now, because a lot of times with your non-clinical summaries, you can have those 90% complete until you're waiting for that carcinogenicity study, and then just pop that last study in there and finish it off. There are hyperlinking issues that you have to consider, but depending on the submission tool, your publisher can give you advice about that.
Okay, great. We are currently submitting our last ever paper IND. It does not have to be 10. It does not have to be 10 item, but can it be paper CTD? I think I'm reading that right.
Yes, it can. But I would encourage you to discuss it, the format that you're submitting in. If you haven't had a pre-IND meeting, make sure that FDA knows what you're doing, that you're submitting a paper IND in CTD format. It's still technically legal, but to be perfectly honest, the FDA expectation these days is electronic CTDs.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for a couple more questions here. What is the minimum team size to effectively prepare an NDA?
Minimum team size. Well, it depends on, obviously, the capabilities of each people. If you have a physician that can cover clinical pharmacology and pharmacovigilance, as well as efficacy, that's one. CMC needs to cover all of CMC. Non-clinical needs to cover all of non-clinical. Biostatistics, I guess you could say, could cover data standards as well. What's that for? If they're all, as I said on the slide, imbued with the regulatory knowledge that is required, I think you need a publisher. And I think 5 would be the minimum that I'd say. Unless I'll open it up to Bob and Rob if they have any other.
I would think that would be about a minimum. And the publisher really doesn't always need to be there, but and it can be very boring for the publisher to sit and listen. But you have no idea how valuable it can be when they're sitting there listening and they hear a plan that impacts a publishing process, and suddenly their little ears go straight up, and they can have extremely valuable input that can affect your timeline. And likewise with solving problems, if suddenly there's a problem, a medical writer has a problem, they can a lot of times offer some very creative solutions that save people a lot of time.
Yeah, and Bob brings up authorship. Obviously, it would be tough for those authors or those individuals to write everything that goes into a marketing application. It's possible, but I think the other, if one of those 5 people is not an excellent project manager, then it will fall apart. So one of those 5 people, and I don't think that can be a distributed function. I think regulatory is fine distributed throughout the team if everyone holds their own regulatory. But someone needs to lead, someone needs to organize to keep that team functioning.
Keep people to timelines.
All right, great. Well, I think that's all the time that we have for right now. So that'll be our last question for the day. We had a lot of great questions. We couldn't get to them all, but we will be getting back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. I want to thank you all for attending this Fierce Live webinar. I also want to thank our speakers for participating and Ro for presenting today's webinar. The webinar has been recorded. You'll be able to access the recording within 24 hours on the same page that you used to register for the event. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tips for a Successful NDA Submission, presented by Roe. I'm Rebecca Williamson, the publisher of the Life Sciences Group, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are David Shoemaker, Senior Vice President of R&D at Roe, Rob Wilson, Chief Strategist of Biostatistics and Data Standards for the Regulatory Submissions at Roe, and Bob Rohde, Submission Services Consultant at Rohde Submission Services. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. I have just a few technical notes for you before we begin.